They pulled her out of the dark between the stars, and the first thing Kale Marin said when her eyes opened was the name of a dead colony. Voss Station, she said. Someone check Voss Station. The medic leaned over her, his face soft with the practiced calm of someone trained to deliver bad news gently. Easy. You've been in transit stasis for how long, not a question. Her voice had the flat certainty of someone who already knew the number was going to be wrong. 14 months. She closed her eyes. 14 months. She'd gone under thinking it was a 6-week recovery passage back to the outer reaches. Someone had miscalculated. Someone or something had let her drift. They gave her a room on the transit platform above Calloway's world, a beige room with a view of brown clouds. And they told her the Frontier Authority wanted a debrief. She gave it to them. All of it. The crash landing on Voss Station's moon, the colony silent on all frequencies, the things she had found moving in the processor tunnels. She laid it out clean and flat, the way she always had, and she watched the 2 authority officials across the table make the same 2 expressions she'd seen on every official face since she'd started telling this story. First the polite attentiveness, then the small careful blankness that meant they'd already decided she was wrong before she'd finished. You were in an emergency stasis pod for 14 months, the younger one said. Your cortisol levels, the isolation. There were tracks, Kale said, non-human. The kind of track something makes when it's moving fast, and it doesn't need light to do it. The station lost contact due to a communications array failure. That's been confirmed. Then who ate the colonists? Silence. Brown clouds moving outside the window. She lost her survey certification that afternoon. Safety review pending, they said. Standard procedure following extended involuntary stasis. She walked out of the authority building into thin Calloway's world air and stood on the steps and breathed it, and tried not to feel like she'd left something important back in that room. Her hands were steady. She'd always had steady hands. It was one of the few things about herself she'd never had to question. She ate at a commissary counter, noodles in pale broth, and she watched the news screen above the food dispensers, showing stock indices and infrastructure reports, and the slow bureaucratic drumbeat of an interstellar civilization that had convinced itself the worst thing that could happen to it was a budget shortfall. She thought about Voss Station. She thought about the woman she'd found in Sub-Level 4, cocooned against the wall in something organic and glistening, still technically alive. Her eyes open and tracking, but her mouth making no sound that could be called human anymore. Kale had put her out of that misery. She hadn't hesitated, and she hadn't slept well since. 3 weeks later, Commander Davin Holt found her working a cargo shift at the Calloway's docks, running crates through a loader rig. And he sat down on a packing container and told her that Voss Station had gone dark again. Went dark 18 months before you found it the first time, he said. He was a compact man, brown-skinned, with the kind of stillness that came from either deep patience or deep exhaustion. She couldn't tell which yet. The authority buried that. New colonists went in, resettlement program, company initiative. New contact came in 6 weeks ago. One automated distress ping, then nothing. Kale set down the loader guide and looked at him. I'm putting together a ground team, Holt said. Frontier Rangers, not authority. We go in, we assess, we extract any survivors. There won't be survivors. Then we confirm that and we burn whatever needs burning. He paused. I read your debrief, all of it, not the sanitized version. I believe you. She picked the loader guide back up, ran the next crate through, set it down again. How many Rangers? 14, good people. Rowan's leading the tactical unit. You'd know the name. She did know the name. Sergeant Dessa Rowan had a reputation that preceded her like a weather system. And you want me for what? You've been inside. You know the layout. You know the movement patterns. You know what the things can do. He said it simply, without drama. You're the only person alive who's seen them up close and come back. Kale looked at the brown clouds through the dock's high windows. 14 months of drifting in the dark between the stars. And here was someone asking her to go back toward the thing she'd drifted away from. I want a weapon, she said. Not a survey flare. A real weapon. Done. And if I say we pull out, we pull out. No committee vote. No command override. Holt looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face. Agreed. She clocked out of the dock shift and didn't look back. The ship was called the Farwatch, a mid-class military transport that smelled of recycled air and boot oil, and the particular institutional smell of people who had been sleeping in close quarters for too long. Kale met the Rangers in the briefing room on the second day out. 14 faces arranged along 2 bench rows with the easy sprawl of people who were very good at their jobs and knew it. A few of them didn't bother hiding that they were assessing her. She was used to that. Sergeant Rowan was small and dark-eyed and ran her briefings with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no patience for dramatics. Cale Marin, survey specialist, the only person to set foot on Voss Station Moon and return with a pulse, she told her rangers. And there was no particular inflection in it, just fact. She'll be advising on target behavior and station layout. You listen to her the same way you'd listen to me. What exactly are we dealing with, survey? Said a ranger named Bex, lounging with the ease of someone who'd asked tougher questions than this. He was broad-shouldered, wore his helmet on his knee like it was a hat. Grinned at everything. Cale put the hologram up, biomechanical skeletal fast. The model she'd built from memory, and the authorities reluctantly shared sensor readings. The room went a little quieter. They move in the dark, she said. They know the architecture better than any map you have. They don't make sound when they don't want to. They use the vents, the crawlways, anywhere your suit thermals won't pick them up in a cluster environment. She paused. They will be between you and every exit you think you have. How many? Rowan said. At Voss Station Moon I counted signs of at least 40. That was 18 months ago. She let that sit. They reproduce fast. Another ranger, young, barely looking, named CV, raised her hand like this was a classroom. What stops them? Sustained fire center mass. They bleed something corrosive, so watch your ricochet angles. They're faster than you expect, and they don't stop for pain. Cale looked around the room. And stay out of the vents. The ship's synthetic crew liaison, a unit designated Meyer, observed from the corner with its characteristic stillness, head slightly tilted, processing at whatever speed those systems processed. Cale had initially bristled at its presence. She had had experiences with synthetic units and their complex loyalties. But Meyer had, over 3 days of careful interaction, proven itself to be straightforwardly useful and somewhat dryly funny, which was two traits she hadn't expected. The survival probability calculus is not encouraging, Meyer told her quietly that night in the corridor outside the briefing room, while the rest of the ship slept. I know. You went back anyway. Someone has to know what they are, Cale said. Someone who'll say it out loud in a room where it matters. Meyer considered this with its characteristic pause. The courage in that position, it said, is the specific kind that doesn't announce itself. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment. She went to sleep and dreamed of corridors. Voss Station Moon broke through the viewport cloud cover like a bruise. All gray-brown regolith and the distant silver glint of the processing towers. Nothing on comms. Nothing on thermal from orbit. The colony grid showed no movement. The colony grid showed, in fact, nothing at all, which was a different kind of horror than active signals would have been. 1,400 colonists, Rowan said at the drop briefing, her voice level. The resettlement brought in another 800 after Marin's first visit. They're not dead, Cale said quietly. The room looked at her. Not all of them. The ones from before weren't dead. That's not what they do with the ones they take. She paused. I need you to understand what you're walking into. Whatever you find alive down there, it will not look like what you're hoping to find. They dropped in 2 ships, split insertion, rangers and equipment, Cale riding the lead ship with Rowan's tactical unit and trying to remember how to breathe in a drop harness. The colony outer ring was intact. Power was running, backup fusion cells, deep automated systems ticking over. The streets were empty in the way that places are never supposed to be empty in the middle of what should have been a working day shift. Personal items on the ground. A child's shoe. Cale didn't look at the shoe. They cleared the outer ring in 40 minutes, methodical, professional, and found the first signs in sublevel 1. The organic material coating the walls, layered thick and dried brown, like the colony's bones had been wrapped in something secreted from the dark. Bex made a joke. Nobody laughed. Even he seemed to understand he'd made it at the wrong moment. Processing core is where they'll have built the main nest, Cale said. She showed them on the map. Deep, warm, lots of structural cover. That's where you'll find the survivors, if any. Rowan nodded once. She pulled her unit back and looked at each of them in turn. Not the look of someone assembling troops, but the look of someone making sure she knew the faces. We go careful, we go quiet, we go that. She paused. And we come back together. Thermal began reading movement in sublevel 3 before they reached the first stairwell. Not one signal, not two. The scanner grid lit up like a city scene from orbit. Dozens of heat signatures moving in patterns that bore no resemblance to random animals. They were distributed. They were coordinated. They were aware. How many, Holt said from the command position, his voice steady with the effort of keeping it that way. Enough, Kale said. They hit the first contact in Sublevel 2 Corridor 7, and the world became very loud and very fast. The things came from above. Not from the vents, but from the ceiling itself, which had been coated and reshaped and turned into something that looked solid, until it wasn't. 3 of them, then 6, then the corridor was a firefight, and Kale was firing a weapon that felt too heavy and too real in her hands. And she was thinking, with a calm that surprised her, about angles and choke points and the way the creatures moved. Rowan's unit held barely, but it held. They pushed back, cleared the corridor, stood in the sudden silence with the sounds of their own breathing overloud in their helmets. Bex had been hit in the arm. He held it against his chest and kept his helmet on, and made another joke, this one weaker than the last. Pull back to Sublevel 1, Kale said. Regroup. We need a different approach. We haven't reached the survivors, Rowan began. We go down there in a running firefight. We die in the dark. They know these tunnels better than we do. We need to make them come to us. She looked at the tactical map. There's a maintenance hub on the outer ring, with line of sight to the processing core access shafts. We set position there. We control the approach. We can send a small team in with cover. Rowan studied the map, and Kale could see the tactical mind running through it, testing the angles, finding the flaws, finding the merits. It works, she said finally. Get Bex patched up. We move in 10. They fell back to the hub and fortified it with what they'd brought and what they could scavenge from the colony stores. Motion sensors and automated guns running on the generator Meyer had spliced into the backup grid. The inside of the hubs smelled like machine oil and the particular metallic cold of a structure that had been unheated too long. They ate ration packs and nobody talked much. Sevie sat in the corner and held her weapon in her lap and stared at the floor. Kale sat beside her. The first time I came here, Kale said, I was alone. No rangers, no backup, no plan. I went in looking for a signal source, and I came out and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking for 3 days. Sevie looked at her. Were you scared? Every second. Kale looked at her own hands, steady as always. She'd learned that the shaking always came after. Being scared is just information. It tells you what to pay attention to. Sevie nodded slowly and didn't look quite as young anymore. Meyer patched through the colony's internal sensor grid from the hub terminal, and they got their first real picture of what was below them. The processing core was not recognizable as a processing core anymore. It had been built over, filled in, transformed into a structure that the sensor data could only approximate, and the human mind could only partially absorb. The organic architecture extended across 4 sublevels, 300 meters of reshaped space, and at its center something was moving that the thermals showed as a single, massive, sustained heat signature. That's the one that runs it, Kale said. The reproductive center of the hive. Everything else is organized around protecting that. Holt looked at the signature for a long time. We could blow the processing core, take the whole thing down, then every colonist still alive down there dies too. Another long look at the signature. How do we know any are still alive? We don't, Kale said, but we check first. Then we burn it. She said it quietly, without drama, and it was the thing that made the room go quiet, because it named what everyone was not saying. They were all hoping the answer would be none, that the math would be clean. Kale had learned to be careful about hoping for that. She and Rowan went in with Sevie and 2 other rangers, moving through sublevel 3 with everything off that could be turned off. Thermal signature suppressed, motion minimized. The things were there in the dark. They could feel them, could hear the occasional chitinous brush of movement in the infrastructure above. But the main body of the hive was consolidated around the core, and the outer tunnels were less heavily patrolled than Kale had feared, as if the hive considered itself beyond needing the full perimeter. That was its miscalculation. She filed it away. They found 11 survivors in a chamber adjacent to the main tunnel access. A family group, 2 parents, 6 children, and 4 more adults from the resettlement wave, all cocooned against the wall in various stages of the process, but still breathing, still present in their eyes when the lights hit them. One of the children, a girl of maybe 10, was cocooned only at her legs, her upper body still free, and she had found something to grip in the dark, a length of cable, and she was holding it with both hands as if she decided that as long as she was holding something, she was still there. Kale cut her loose first. The girl didn't speak. She held onto the cable, and then she held on to Kale, and Kale carried her and didn't put her down while Rowan and Sevie worked the others. 11 people in various states of shock. 3 who needed to be carried, all of them looking at the rangers with the specific expression of people who had been in the dark so long, That light had become something they needed to approach slowly. They were 3 minutes from the access shaft when the motion sensors in Kale's earpiece screamed. Not one signal, not a patrol, the main body of the hive was moving toward them. "Run," Rowan said, and they ran. The girl held on with both arms locked around Kale's neck and didn't make a sound while the world behind them erupted in motion. The Rangers ran covering fire in relays, one firing while two ran, two firing while one ran. The practiced geometry of people who had trained for exactly this, and were now doing it for real with everything they had. Sevie took a hit on her shoulder plate that spun her sideways, and she caught herself on the wall and kept running. Bex appeared from a side junction. He'd been on perimeter watch, and fell in without a word, firing at the shapes coming from the ceiling. They hit the access shaft and went up. Kale made the hub entrance last, turned and sealed the blast door and stood with her back against it, while the things hit the other side once, twice, then went silent. That silence was worse than the noise. Inside the hub, the survivors were in the corner, wrapped in emergency thermal blankets. The girl had finally let go of Kale, and was sitting with a thermal blanket around her shoulders, holding the length of cable she'd brought with her from the dark. She looked at Kale with direct, clear eyes. "Are there more?" she asked. "We'll find them," Kale said. She didn't add if any. The girl was 10 years old, and she had held onto a cable in the dark for weeks. She deserved a straight answer. The hub held through the night cycle, or what passed for night, the external windows going from gray to black, while the automated gun systems ran through their ammunition, dealing with probing attempts at the door. Meyer ran the hub systems with extraordinary efficiency, rotating power between defense, sensors, and communication, maintaining a constant encrypted uplink to the Farwatch above. "We need to go deeper," Kale told Holt at the 4-hour mark. "Not to rescue more survivors. There aren't more survivors to rescue." She'd run the numbers on the sensor data. 11 was what there was. "We need to go deeper because if we leave that hive intact, they'll spread. They use the resettlement ships. They use this colony the same way they use the moon installation. They let the humans come to them." "You're saying they planned it," Holt said. "I'm saying they're not an infestation, they're a strategy." Another silence. She watched him absorb it, the particular weight of a truth that changes the shape of everything around it. "The processing core," he said. "If we vent the coolant loops and trigger a cascade failure in the fusion cells, the explosion takes out everything in a quarter-kilometer radius. Everything below sublevel 2. We set it on a timer, we pull back, we're out before it goes. And you get to the core how? The ventilation maintenance shafts on the east ring bypass the main tunnel network. They're too small for the creatures. Or they should be. I go through those, I reach the core level, I set the charges, I come back." She paused. "Alone." Rowan, who had been listening from across the hub, turned around. "That's not how we do it. You have 11 survivors to get to the dropship. You have Beck's arm and Sevie's shoulder, and 3 Rangers running on stimulants. You have exactly enough to make the extraction work if everyone moves together, and nothing goes wrong." Kale looked at her steadily. "The second something goes wrong in the vents, you need everyone you have up here." Rowan looked at her for a long time. The look of someone doing math they didn't want to do, and arriving at an answer they hated. 30 minutes, Rowan said finally. "You have 30 minutes before we take everyone to the dropship and call the extraction. I'll need 25. She went alone into the ventilation shafts with charges, a cutting tool, and a weapon. And the small flat fact that she had been alone in a place like this before and she had come out. That memory was not exactly comfort, but it was something to hold like a cable in the dark. The shafts were coffin-tight, metal walls close on all sides, and she moved through them on her elbows with the methodical rhythm of someone doing a job. The sounds of the hive were everywhere below her. Organic, rhythmic, a biomechanical pulse that she felt in her palms against the shaft floor. She passed 2 junction grates that looked down into the hive's infrastructure, and she did not stop to look. Looking wasn't the mission. She reached the core-level access point with 7 minutes to spare and cut through the grate and dropped into the heat. The processing core chamber was barely recognizable. The machinery was there, buried under layers of the same organic secretion that coated the tunnels, but functional. The hive had kept the fusion cells running, using the heat, using the power. Smart, completely and horribly smart. She moved along the maintenance walkway, staying out of the central chamber, setting charges at the coolant junctions with hands that were very steady, and a mind that was very quiet. She was on the last charge when she felt the change in the air. Not sound, pressure. The way a room changes when something very large enters it. She looked up from the junction panel and it was there, at the center of the chamber. Vast and ancient-looking, in the way that things are when they have never needed to hide. 12 feet tall at its full extension, segmented, with a tail that moved with the slow authority of something that had never been threatened by anything it couldn't kill. Its head swung toward her with a deliberate slowness that was more terrible than speed would have been. They looked at each other. Kale thought about a lot of things in that moment. She thought about the girl holding the cable. She thought about Rowan's face when she'd said 30 minutes. She thought about the woman in sublevel 4 on the moon, the one she'd found still alive, still watching, and she thought about the mercy she'd given and the cost it had carried. She lifted the flamethrower she'd taken from the hub stores, and she let it speak. The queen moved. It was fast, faster than something that size had any right to be, but it was moving toward her, and she was already moving, back along the walkway, and the fire was buying her seconds. The chamber filled with heat and the angry screech of something that was not used to being threatened. She ran, and the detonator was in her hand, and she was counting steps to the access shaft. And behind her the queen's tail took out a section of railing, and she felt the wind of it. She hit the shaft entrance and went up. The queen hit the wall below and could not follow. Kale came out of the ventilation system into the east corridor, and she ran, and the detonator was in her hand. And she counted to 3 to make sure the charges were set, and she pressed it. The sound was deep and then expanding, a vibration that started below and rose through the floor into her boots, up through her legs, into her chest. She felt it more than heard it. Through 3 floors of structure and organic material, something very old and very large was being unmade. She was halfway to the hub when Rowan appeared in the corridor ahead of her, running the other way, and Kale thought she was going to say something about 30 minutes. Instead, Rowan just fell in beside her, and they ran together, which was better than words anyway. The dropship was at the perimeter landing pad. Ramp down, Holt and Meyer running the survivors up, while Rangers held the perimeter in a loose arc, and the ground was shaking now in a way that meant the fusion cascade was progressing. Not much time. Go, Kale said, and the arc collapsed and everyone went up the ramp and the ramp came up while the shaking intensified. They were 2 kilometers out when the processing core went. The viewport filled white for a moment, then orange. Then the shockwave hit the ship, and it was a rough minute before the pilot pulled them into stable air. Kale watched the colony through the viewport, the bloom of fire, the towers falling, the slow subsidence of something massive being taken apart from the inside. The girl sat across from her in the dropship, still wrapped in the thermal blanket, still holding the cable. She looked at the fire through the viewport too. "It's gone?" she asked. "It's gone." The girl looked at the fire for another moment, and then she tucked the cable under her arm, wrapped the thermal blanket tighter, and leaned against Kale's side and closed her eyes. Kale held still and let her sleep. That was the part she hadn't expected, going back the first time, or the second, that it would be this specific. Not the tactics, not the survival, but this, a child's weight against her arm, trusting, and the particular quality of responsibility that came with being the person someone had decided to trust. She sat still and watched the fire fade below them and felt the weight and held it. On the far watch, in the medical bay, Beck showed everyone his arm as if he was proud of it. CV sat on a bunk and let the ship's medic work on her shoulder and looked at the ceiling. Holt wrote his report in the corner, with the expression of someone composing words that were going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. Meyer sat beside Kale at the observation port, both of them looking at Calloway's world getting larger below them. 1,400 colonists the first time, Meyer said. 800 the second. And 11 survivors, Kale said. And 11 survivors. They sat in that number for a while. It was a terrible number. It was also the number that had come out of the dark, and it was what there was. The authority will want another debrief, Meyer said. I know. Will you say the same things you said last time? Kale thought about the woman in the sublevel. The girl with the cable. The sound the fusion core made when it went. All of it true. All of it requiring someone to stand in a room and say it clearly and not look away from the careful blankness on the faces across the table. Yes, she said. And this time I'll have 11 people who'll say it with me. She looked at the planet through the port, and she thought about the debrief, and she thought about everything she was going to have to describe. The architecture of the hive, the behavior of the creatures, the thing in the core chamber, and what it implied about organization and intention and scale. She was going to have to describe it in clear, plain language to people who were going to want very much not to believe her. And she was going to do it because it was the only thing that mattered now. The only thing that had ever mattered. Someone had to know. Someone had to stand in the room and say it without looking away. Her hands were steady. They always were. Below the ship, the stars were coming out, appearing one by one in the dark between the worlds, each one a sun with its own planets and its own installations, and its own small human outposts of warmth and noise and ordinary life. She looked at them, and she thought about what was out there beyond the mapped edges, in the dark between the stars where the things lived. And she thought about the girl holding the cable. And she decided that knowing was better than not knowing, and finding out too late. She was a survey specialist. She surveyed. She would keep going out until someone listened, or until there was no one left to not listen. And either way, she would go out with steady hands, and she would see what was there, and she would say what she saw. And if that was all she could do, then that was what she would do. Because humans were not the strongest things in the dark, and they were not the fastest, and they were not the oldest, but they were the ones who named the dark and mapped it and went back to it even knowing what was in it. And they were the ones who found 11 people in a hive and brought them out. And they were the ones who sat children in thermal blankets and held still so the sleeping could continue. And they were the ones who, when someone needed it, said in a clear voice in a bright room, "Here is what is out there, here is what it can do, and here is what we do now." She was going to say it again. She was going to keep saying it. The stars waited, patient as they always were, and the ship moved through them. And below Kale the girl slept with a cable tucked under her arm like a thing worth keeping, and above her Holloway's world fell away into the dark, and the Farwatch pressed on, and the crew of it breathed in and out in the recycled air of a mid-class military transport that smelled of boot oil and effort, and the specific persistent stubbornness of people who were, against all available evidence, still here.